What the fuck is going on in our country, Jill? Help. Please make sense of it.
Uh,
And how half the country is okay with it and half the country feels like it's a five-alarm fire.
yeah, I really wish I had a pithy, brilliant, and also somehow reassuring and at the same time prophetic, brilliant thing to say to you about the state of the country. It is a mess. I've been traveling around talking to people about the book and really, which is just a pretext to talking to people about, do we have the constitution that we want as a country? Is our constitution still alive? Are we the authors of it? Is this administration behaving unconstitutionally? Just kind of have those conversations. And just in the last 2 weeks of popping around different parts of the country, it just feels like there's a great sinking feeling, more so than at any point over the last 10 years where there's, kind of we've reeled from crisis to crisis. And I think the rhetoric of emergency and crisis is our go-to language to talk about whatever your beliefs are about the direction of the country or whatever your politics are, the language of emergency unites people across a political spectrum, right? If it's an emergency because Trump is president, or it's for Trump, it's an emergency and that allows him to do the things he's doing. And I think it's as important as it is to not minimize what's going on. I think it's kind of very hard to think through problems with the language of emergency. So it's been really disheartening to see how defeated people are, how confused. And I think it is a time to maybe broaden our understanding of the past, because this is one of the reasons I study history, maybe the reason I study history, because I think we get our bearings from the past. And if we're trying to navigate to a future that we can all share in and believe in, I think we really do need to have a better and more common understanding of the past.
I couldn't agree with you more, but do you feel like, as a student of history and someone who teaches it and writes about it, do you feel that you have studied trends and periods? Do you feel this is wholly new and for you um sort of mind-blowing? Or do you feel, can you ground it in some kind of history, what we're seeing in the country now? Can you ground it in other periods of time that help
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
that gives you a better perspective than some of us who are not as well versed in history as you are?
Yeah, I think I can. For me, I find a fair amount of solace there. I will say that just in speaking to audiences, which I really only did for the first time, like in like a large gatherings in 2018 when I wrote this book, These Truths: A History of the United States, that I wrote because I felt like the country kind of didn't any longer have a national story that had any relationship to historical research, historical scholarship, historical evidence, any accountability to historical methods. We had sort of two competing accounts of the nation's story. One was the story of America is a story of greatness and prosperity and freedom and a march of progress. And the other is the story of America is a litany of atrocities, forms of oppression, and ongoing illiberalism. And, there's truth to both of those stories, but neither of those stories represents, uh, neither of those stories can be fully true, right? They're both largely ideologically driven accounts of the past that have little relationship to historical scholarship. So I'd written this book, and then I went around the country and I talked to a lot of people about it, and I I kept saying, I would text my husband after. I was like, it happened again. There are three things that come up in every public conversation because people are desperate to talk about history and the past and its relationship to the future. The three questions would always be: has it ever been this bad before? Kind of a little bit version of what you were just asking. Who can we blame? And can you save us? and I think that's people who go to book talks, like they're really concerned, right? They're concerned citizens, they're readers, they're thinkers, they're engaged members of their community. And those are real concerns. And I came up with some sort of answers for those. And I was just thinking this week whether my answers to those questions, whatever, 8 years later, 6 years later, are different. Um, yes, it has been this bad before. I mean, there is not a day today of forms of concern about our polity and the possibility of equality and equal rights and community that is not a better day than any day when slavery was still legal in this country. There's just not. Like, you just cannot imagine a world in which human bondage is the engine of the economy of the nation. We, I think, really need to not lose sight of that. Um, the days of segregation, the days of Japanese like there have been there in fact have been atrocities in American history that if we think it matters a little bit what the has it ever been that bad before, this bad before? Well, it depends what it is. If it is all of us and we have a broad understanding of the history of our country, then it has been much worse. And that's not to take pressure off the urgency of the need for improvements to our civic health and civil society. It's not to ignore the dangerousness of rising political violence in this country. But political violence in the 1960s was significantly worse, and knock wood that we're not headed in that direction. The number of bombings in the 1960s and early 70s, the major political assassinations, Kent State, the long hot summers of racial unrest in the 60s, the incidents of police brutality against civil rights activists, nonviolent protesters. That's a far more recent history that we have where we can see the real sort of disassembly of any kind of consensus about what the country is or is for or is about. I mean, we could even look to say the bicentennial of the American Revolution in 1975, 1976, because we're just on the eve of the semi-quincentennial, the America 250th in 2026. The bicentennial, I mean, I was a kid and I remember all the fun things like sewing my own colonial dress and wearing a mob cap and my brother shooting the cap gun musket in the backyard. But the bicentennial was extraordinarily contentious and it was really fraught. And, the Lyndon Johnson assembled a bicentennial commission and Nixon then replaced it. Then there was a People's Bicentennial Commission. Then every event was protested by different groups. It was in the context of Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, the withdrawal from Saigon in 75, the big campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. There was just a lot of unrest, the prominence of the rising American Indian movement with the occupation of Alcatraz, Wounded Knee. That's within the living memory of many Americans who are alive today. Those were very tumultuous times that, when the bumper sticker, love it or leave it kind of campaign where uh, our era of polarization really begins and dates to 1968. Admittedly, it's been rising continuously ever since 68, and so has income inequality, and they kind of track one another. They're two kind of parallel graphs. But um, what we are seized by and in the grips of right now has quite precise historical origins. And I think, like anything else, like, your relationship with your kid or your marriage or how you get along with your adult parents, understanding how you got to where you are in that relationship is kind of a prerequisite of improving it.
You mentioned all these very tumultuous times, and I think you're right. It's is sort of helpful for me to think back on these times. Jessica Fillion, who's watching, says, I think what makes this different that most of us were children or not alive when those atrocities occurred.
Yeah.
So this feels more vivid, live, and in color. But I also feel like, and maybe this is incorrect because I wasn't a journalist when some of these things were happening, and I was about to graduate. I guess I was in my first year of college for the bicentennial, but it feels so widespread. Like every piece of society, from science to public policy to race relations to everything, it feels like it's all unraveling, like that our social fabric is being pulled, not just in one arena, but the entire quilt of America feels like it's fraying and being ripped apart simultaneously. And I also think, while I'm sure you have been and many presidents deserve to be criticized, I think that the way Donald Trump sees his role in the country and the way his minions and associates see their roles in completely dismantling all these different aspects of American life, it just feels so different to me.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I don't mean to minimize what's going on. I just mean to sort of say
Yeah,
there are
right.
reasons to put it in a historical context. But I remember during the first Trump administration, I pulled out a book that uh, I pulled out of the library here at Harvard that I had never been checked out before. And I wish I could remember what it was called. But during Watergate, the House committee asked the Yale historian C. Van Woodward to research whether any president had done anything like what Nixon was accused of doing, because some Republicans on the committee were like, okay, so this seems bad, but maybe this is just what all presidents do, and we just don't know that. Like, they keep it secret very effectively, which was a very reasonable empirical question. So they asked Stephen Woodward to put together a group of people who could very quickly do research on presidential misconduct. And so Woodward wrote to like all of his graduate students who are now professors, and then they wrote to their graduate students, and they kind of like whipped up this team of like a dream team of researchers to research every single president and his misconduct, if any. And then they wrote up this report. But by the time because of course, real scholarship takes a little while. By the time they finished, even though they're going lightning speed, like superhero speed, faster than a speeding bullet, the Nixon had basically resigned by the time they finished. So the House, like, it was basically, they were quite frustrated because I don't think it was even really put in the public record. So they privately published the book, and I went and read it, um, and during Trump's first administration. And geez, there's a lot of nickel and diming and penny ante corruption. I mean, a lot of like nepotism, um, and some fairly significant ethical breaches. But nothing that really rivaled what Nixon had done. And I wrote to all of the historians who are still alive who'd worked on the project and said, how do you compare this to 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 the beginning of the Trump administration? And I would say this was not this Trump administration, which is
The
actually quite
first.
effectively doing a number of just truly staggeringly illegal and unconstitutional things. That was, there been attempts to do such things in the first administration, but largely were unsuccessful. But I wrote a little piece about this because all the historians are like, yeah, no, it's just not, it's an interesting thing to look at, but there's no comparison between what Nixon stood accused of doing and what Trump was engaged in doing. So I do think there's, as you suggest, we can look at a trajectory and say, why do things keep getting worse if that's how it feels to people? But we have to recognize we're looking at a very different scale.
Yes. And I think you talked about sort of the Constitution. So I wanna ask you about the book, because this book is it feels so prescient, because I think so many Americans don't have enough of a grounding in civics or how the Constitution really works. Honestly, and a lot of the stuff I know about civics, I don't remember a lot of it. And I think I got a pretty good education. But tell me about this particular book, why you wrote it, and what you're hoping it will do for people.
Yeah, I have that same experience. We had a civics class in ninth grade in my public high school, and our civics teacher was just drunk the whole year. So I didn't learn really, honestly, anything. I mean, I went to a great public school, but that was not a really productive class. Um, so when I wrote these truths, after it came out, I've gotten such an incredibly moving email and letters from readers, and one of the things that people were really grateful for was how much constitutional history was in this book. There's a lot of social history and political history and intellectual history, history of technology, but that interests me, right? How do we rule ourselves? How does law work? Has always interested me. And I really took that to heart, and it made me think, well, I probably could write a whole second volume, a new history of the United States that just told from the vantage of constitutional history. And the reason I wanted to do that is I do think that we don't really have much of a sense of what the Constitution is and how it works, and sort of even what it's for, and is it still working?
And
And
also
consider
all that, and I sorry to interrupt, Jill, but I was thinking all the state constitutions
Right,
that were
right,
being cobbled together sort of
yeah,
simultaneously, right?
yeah,
Or
yeah. I think there's some research that many Americans don't even know they have state constitutions, right? Which I'm very sympathetic with. I'm not trying to like make fun of anyone, but to the degree we think about the Constitution, I think we just think about it as a document that's in the hands of the Supreme Court. So it comes up every once in a while. Well, what did the Supreme Court say about something? And now we have a slightly different version of the Constitution because the court interpreted it differently. And that's I think, a distortion. That's a manufactured distortion of our current constitutional reality, right? Because we do live in a country right now where the Constitution is not only what the Supreme Court says it is, but right now the Constitution is what the president says it is, which is no part of our constitutional arrangement, right? There's no role for the president of the United States in determining the meaning of the Constitution or its application, right? So
but he's embraced that role and taken it and
he has embraced that
kind
role, right? So,
go ahead,
we're
sorry.
saying like, okay, if it's not for him, like, how is the thing supposed to work? Like, he is not allowed to say. I mean, he could say it, but it shouldn't have any meaning at all when he says, birthright citizenship is in the Constitution, um, or whatever he is lately saying. So, I really wanted to write an account of the history of the Constitution that, while recognizing the hugely important role of the Supreme Court, of course, in constitutional history, but that opened out to a broader understanding of how ordinary Americans play a role in constitutional meaning making, both in the interpretations and that they give to the Constitution, but also historically and what Americans have wanted from the Constitution. And the book tries to restore centrally to our understanding of constitutionalism, of the very idea that there should be constitutions, which is an 18th century idea. It's pretty recent in human history. The idea that Americans came up with is that if we're going to write down fundamental law, a constitution governs the government and laws govern the people. If we're going to write down this thing that decides what the government can and cannot do, we might change our minds about that. And therefore, we should leave for ourselves the ability to amend, to change, to improve, to repair, to correct, to modify, to adjust our Constitution. And that is the amendment provision of our Constitution. We amend our state constitutions all the time. I think people you probably had ballot questions on your ballot, like, should we do this? But we don't amend the federal Constitution very often. And, you talked about being in college during the bicentennial. The last time the US Constitution was meaningfully amended is 1971. So honestly, I think a lot of Americans don't even know it can be done. And I'm not saying it really, like, I don't have a constitutional amendment agenda, but the idea that the people write the Constitution, ratify the Constitution, and have a right to amend it if the Constitution is not working well is the idea on which our Constitution is based. So we really, I think, ought to think about that. Like, do we still have the Constitution in the sense that it was originally written if we don't even believe in the power of amendment any longer?
Yeah, and it does feel like such a distant document and such an untouchable thing. Do you need
I have I have a dog barking at the door, so that's
Oh,
all.
okay.
He's here now. We're all good.
Oh, tell your dog hi. What's your dog's name?
That's Rufus.
Oh, hi, Rufus. Okay, everyone.
He's back
Rufus.
there.
Rufus
Sorry.
has entered the conversation. In fact, I think one interesting thing about your book is, well, maybe so you've explained the agenda. I'm sorry, the amendment. Good Lord, I need more coffee. The amendment process. But I think what is really inspiring in your book is how active just normal citizens were historically in making sure some of these amendments were included and passed. Can you talk about that, for example, in Massachusetts?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it is really inspiring how not always successfully, but how with what determination ordinary Americans have uh, chosen to dedicate themselves to constitutional reform. So, from the very beginning, when the states were drafting their constitutions, they were all experimenting. Like when the royal governors fled and the colonial governments collapsed, the states were like, "I guess we need to have a government. What should it look like?" And each state kind of came up with its own plan. Like, you imagine right now, if all 50 states didn't have a government, they had to devise one, they'd be really different governments, right? They
Yeah,
they
you
look very
think?
different. Yeah. Yeah. So, Pennsylvania, I think they didn't have a governor. Like, people just had different ways of doing things. But what sort of emerged over time was a shared commitment to three big ideas. One, that the legislature shouldn't be writing the Constitution. Like, that doesn't make any sense because they're going to just give themselves all the power. So, like, you had to have a special elected group of people to write a constitution. These were called conventions. And then they couldn't just decide, then this is our constitution. You had to send it to the people to ratify, like in a popular vote. And then, like, as in Massachusetts, when the Massachusetts legislature violated this first principle and wrote the Constitution and sent it to the people to ratify, the people rejected it and said, "Well, you can't write it. We have to have a constitutional convention. And also, you forgot to leave in an amendment mechanism. Like, you can't just say this is the law, fundamental law forever. We have to have reserved to ourselves as a people the right to amend this thing." So the fact that we even this was in 1778, the fact that we even have an amendment provision in our Constitution is due to towns of Massachusetts rejecting a constitution that they didn't like. But then there are all these ways that the mechanism of people who are disenfranchised is the petition, right? If you can't vote and don't have the right to vote, you don't have the right to hold office. You Everyone has the right to petition. Even women, even people held as slaves can petition the government. So one of the things I really spent a lot of time with was reading petitions submitted to the state legislatures or to state constitutional conventions or to Congress saying, "Okay, you forgot something. Like, by the way, you failed to end slavery. By the way, we don't have the right to vote. By the way, we don't have guaranteed equal rights." And these ways that ordinary Americans, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, used petitioning and proposed amendments to push for moral reform, to push for the promise of the Constitution to be realized, the freedoms and guarantees that were in the Constitution to be extended to embrace a wider and wider group of Americans. So, first, poor white men, and then to some degree, women, to some degree, Black men, and then push and push and push. And then, meanwhile, there's this whole other tradition of Native nations holding constitutional conventions across American history and themselves experimenting with new constitutional ideas that come back and have an influence on the states. Like this convention of Oklahoma Cherokee in 1905. They write a convention for what was going to be the new state of Sequoia that becomes Oklahoma, which essentially uses the Cherokee Constitution. So there's just a world of um, I just like a blossoming of constitutional ideas, experimentation. Some of it is horrible. You look back at what some of these conventions did, it's horrible. It's a good thing they could be amended because they did a bunch of terrible things that later generations amended out. But that just the agitation, the involvement of so many people in so many ways, and in the determination, um, the decades long struggle to get slavery out of the Constitution. Then, after the word male is introduced in the Constitution in the 15th Amendment, the 50-year struggle to get the word male out of the Constitution. Um, you know, there's many, many, many more efforts that fail. There are many efforts in recent decades of conservatives to amend the Constitution. I just think that we just need that bigger history that to render it visible and then think about what it means.
Do you think that people have forgotten that they have a that they actually have input in some of these things? Because that seems so long ago. And this idea that the Constitution, of course, originalism is against this idea, but the idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, I
Hmm.
think I think people have forgotten, well, can I actually have impact on this? Is that part of the purpose of your writing the book, to say that normal people can have a say in this?
I really don't have a prescription. I think it's worth noting what is lost in our deciding that we don't have a say in it, and trying to reveal how it came to be that way. Um, I would say there are many, many Americans on the left who, and many on the right, and many with the sort of main body of Americans, the sort of 60% of Americans that are not on either political extreme, who the last thing they want to do is amend the Constitution because it's a democratic process and they fear democracy right now. There's a lot of defending, let's save democracy, but there's also a lot of real fear of democracy. Oh, if we were to hold a constitutional convention, people say this to me all the time at events, like we would just end up with a MAGA constitution. Like the Republican state houses would appoint the delegates, and we would have a constitutional convention where civil rights would be dismantled, the federal government would be dismantled. And I think that's true. And I don't want to be sort of a useful idiot by promoting, for a cause that I don't personally think is good for the country. But on the other hand, we sort of have a MAGA constitution already. And then I guess in terms of whether your original question, have people lost that sense that we are the authors of the Constitution? I guess I would sort of put it to you, Katie. Like, what do you remember about the battle for the ERA, which you would have been very closely observing at the time?
Well, I remember that so many people supported it, and then there were two states, right? And then Virginia, my home state, finally approved it. And then, but there was something about the time frame, and too much time had passed, and so it never really got done. And that's what I remember.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much it. So I think the ERA is a good place to look to try to figure out what really happened to amendment. There had been 4 amendments ratified between 1961 and 1971, which is a lot, right? That's just
Yeah.
objectively a lot. And the last of those was the 26th, um, in 71, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, which people had wanted to do for a long time, but really was the student anti-war movement. Like, I can't even vote and I can be drafted. That led to that. And it is a hugely important amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment, which had been first introduced in Congress in 1923, finally passes in 1972 and goes to the states. And as you say, there was huge public support for it. Something like 80% of Americans polled in like very reasonably conducted surveys supported the Equal Rights Amendment. It seemed like, I think, to its supporters, this was
A
sort of a no-brainer.
no-brainer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like, this was just going to be rolling off a log. It's just get a number of states. And so they did
Wait,
it.
wait, maybe we should just remind people what the Equal Rights Amendment stated, real quickly, Jill.
So the Equal Rights Amendment prohibits Congress from passing a law that discriminates on the basis of sex. So it's a guarantee of equal rights for women, essentially. Um, so people thought it would be very quickly adopted, and I think maybe didn't wage the battle that they might have done if they knew how much resistance they would encounter when, at the very last minute, a time limit was put on the amendment in Congress, a 7-year expiration date. And that still looked like, well, that'll be plenty of time. Um, and also there was then, oh, well, it'll be good. It'll take a few years because all the states have to be in session, um, and it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. People are like, oh, it'll be good. It'll be done by July 4th, 1776, the nation's 200th birthday. We'll celebrate like this final piece of the puzzle being put into place. But very quickly,
1976, not
19 yeah,
1776.
1976. Sorry, I
Yeah,
spent too much time
that's
in
okay.
the 18th century. But very quickly, the political genius and leader of the conservative movement, Phyllis Schlafly, launched an organization called Stop ERA. and really came up with a brilliant ground game in the states to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. And it's not that hard. You only have to knock off a few states, right? Three-quarters is a pretty high bar when you think about it. And she also was just trying to, like, wait out the clock, right?
Right.
So the proponents then got a 3-year extension, so the expiration was gonna be 1982. But Schlafly was incredibly effective. Her messaging was really effective, and her organizing skills were formidable. And the proponents of the ERA did not have that kind of ground game because they were not anticipating such opposition. So the window ended in 1982. There are people today who are still fighting over the ERA because some states have since ratified and some states have since rescinded their ratifications. But there are some people who argue that the time limit itself was unconstitutional. It's not provided for in the Constitution that you can do such a thing. And there are people who argue that so too you can't rescind a ratification. Like, you just can't do that. Like, who says you can do that? So if the time limit was not allowed and the rescindings were not allowed, then enough states have in fact ratified the ERA. So there are people who say, and Joe Biden said this on his kind of way out the door, oh, the ERA has actually been ratified. And the president has no role in constitutional amendments. So it was just kind of catnip for his supporters. But I think the fact that the ERA failed really changed people's sense of the possibility of amending the Constitution. It had been, you kind of couldn't have thought of not innocuous, but like, it took a lot to make up a story about how the ERA was going to be bad for women, which was what Schlafly's story was. It just didn't take that much to defeat it. And even Antonin Scalia once said that he did the math, and it turns out you really only need about 2% of the population to oppose a constitutional amendment to defeat its ratification. So it's just impossible. It is, is effectively impossible right now. No one's spending money on a constitutional amendment campaign. It would be just throwing money down the drain.
So you mentioned Scalia because he, I think, in that uh, DC versus Heller case in 2008, um, this kind of really shifted the conversation. Can you talk about that decision, Scalia's role in it, and why this was such an important development?
Yeah. So when the ERA was failing, at that point, social and fiscal conservatives in this country were also like the women's rights movement, were seeking constitutional amendments. After Roe was decided, legalizing abortion in 1972, conservatives began proposing right to life amendments, like to overturn Roe with a constitutional amendment. In the late 70s, they began proposing balanced budget amendments. One of those passed the Senate. Reagan supported both of those amendments. But it increasingly became clear over the course of the 70s and early 80s that the path to amendment, was fenced off. Like, no one on any side of the aisle is going to get an amendment through. And so the Reagan Justice Department decided to pursue a different path to constitutional change, which was to seek to replace a largely liberal Supreme Court with a conservative Supreme Court. And not just that, but because they had argued for so long that the Supreme Court can't change the Constitution by interpretation, they had opposed Roe and many other decisions dating back to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ended segregation. They couldn't really say, let's take over the court and then let's get the Constitution we want by interpreting it the way we want, because they'd come to power by arguing that judges can't do that. So they had a different idea, which was they would take over the court and then they would not change the Constitution. They would restore the original intention, meaning, and understanding of the Constitution. So they would not be involved in legislating from the bench, as it was called. They would instead be involved in constitutional restoration and fidelity, um, and reverence for the original Constitution, and deference, not arrogance, deference to the framers of the Constitution. So this became known as originalism. It was called that beginning in 1980. Scalia was appointed to the bench in 1986. Robert Bork's failed nomination, which viewers might remember, was 1987, which happened to be the bicentennial of the Constitution. And now we have a Supreme Court that is predominantly originalist, and much of the federal judiciary is as well. Reagan was extremely successful. So one of the things that what Scalia thought was really the triumph of the originalist model
Is this
was
the
the
same as
decisions.
is that the same as being a strict constructionist?
It's a little bit different, but it is quite closely related.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right,
Yeah.
okay, good, okay.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of doctrine and jargon
I feel like I need to go to law
that can be
school.
confounding. I know. There's also like 15 different varieties of originalism.
Yeah.
So, uh, and in which have different aims and different degrees of principle to them. But I think also just in our culture as a large, I think most people have absorbed the political message that the originalism movement put to the American people, which is the right thing to do is to defer to the original intention of the framers. And people who have a different way of interpreting the Constitution don't have as good an account of why they do that. Anyway, for Scalia, the triumph of originalism was a decision, an opinion he wrote in 2008, in the case called Heller versus DC, in which the Supreme Court decided for the first time that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to keep and bear arms, where previously the Second Amendment hadn't really been the subject of any real litigation. There's one Supreme Court case from 1939 that found unanimously that it guaranteed the right of people to bear arms for the common defense. So the Heller decision in 2008 offered a very different interpretation of the Second Amendment that had been in the courts previously, and it was based on a report written in 1982 by Orrin Hatch, heading a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, in which Hatch argued that his research had revealed that the original meaning and importance and intent of the Second Amendment had been lost, forgotten, erased for centuries, and that it needed to be restored. And so for Scalia, the Heller decision was the illustration of the power of originalism.
And okay, so and that which was basically that individuals had a right to bear arms, that it wasn't just sort of uh, a well-regulated militia, right?
Right.
It was
Yeah.
actual individuals. And so by changing the Supreme Court and giving them so much power, I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like judicial activism, I guess that's the other side of the coin, where if you do truly believe the Constitution is a living, breathing argument and society changes and evolves and reassesses that why would you want it just according to the framers who didn't recognize blacks and, and women and were flawed perhaps because of the times they were living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting to me, I mean, I think originalists, are really believe in their judicial philosophy and are acting in good faith on principles. And uh, I don't, I'm not persuaded by it as a mode of constitutional interpretation. Not least because it's not original. It's not how the framers wanted the Constitution to be interpreted. But as where I really object to it, though, is it's just very bad history. Like it has very little to do with history. And I think it would be fair to say originalists are just not engaged in history in a way that's recognizable to historian. So, for instance, when the framers met in Philadelphia, in 1787, they took a vow of secrecy for 50 years, right? They nailed the windows shut. These were secret deliberations, and they didn't send or receive mail. The way, like when you're sequestered for a jury. But Benjamin Franklin, who was elderly, he died not 3 years later, but the last letter he got before he was sequestered from his dear sister Jane in Boston. I once wrote a biography of Jane Franklin. I'm obsessed with her. And she wrote a very funny letter to him about, like, she's very miffy, like, "Oh, you and these wise men in Philadelphia, I hope you will make us a really great constitution. It's so good that you're doing that." Um, but and she, she meant that, but she also was teasing him. They had a very kind of
Yeah.
they were very close. And she says to him, now this is a woman who has lived through the military occupation of Boston, the Revolutionary War. She's, her sons have fought in battle. She has had friends who were raped by British soldiers. she's given birth to 12 children, buried 11 of them. Like, she's a woman who she's like not rags to riches, but rags to rags, has a tremendous amount of suffering in her life. And she writes him this letter and she says, I hope your wise men in Philadelphia will remember to beat the swords into plowshares. This biblical allusion to living peaceably. She says, so that we may live peaceably among one another. And that's, in my opinion, a constitutional view. That is a constitutional opinion. That is one person's view of what a system of a frame of government that governs the government ought to include. And it is essentially a form of pacifism. Now, she was not a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, but as a matter of history, what she wrote really matters. Like, her views count to the historical record. They tell us something that might reveal that had women been included in large numbers at the Constitutional Convention, in fact, we might have a different constitution. And that's never really been remedied. So to say now in 2025, the only way to understand any part of the Constitution is to exclude, for instance, letters that Jane Franklin might have written to Benjamin Franklin as having any bearing on the Constitution or its history, is to really misrepresent our past and to essentially import into the 21st century the inequalities of the 18th.
Two questions, because I know we're almost out of time, but it seems to me if Article 5 of the Constitution enumerates the ability to make amendments, right? If the framers wanted the potential of amendments, right? And the first amendments happened very shortly after the Constitution was ratified, right, Jill?
Yeah, the Bill of Rights.
So that in and of itself, to me, goes against this idea of originalism, because they saw the importance of being able to make amendments, right?
Yeah, they absolutely did. What we're left with today, I think, is the obligation to try to understand the difference between their views and ours, but not only that, the struggles of ordinary Americans in the 200, nearly 50 years in between. I do have another thing I have to run to. So, thanks
Well,
so much.
thank
This
you
has
for
been
doing
really
this. Thank
delightful.
you so much. And I'm gonna recommend your book to everyone. And there's so many social questions. You're so nice to answer comments on articles. So maybe I'll send them to you and I'll publish them on Substack.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay,
Thanks
thanks,
everyone
Jill.
for okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone. Okay.